This is William Goodman, and I just stepped into the Vactor-Verse.
I am Vactor, and this is the Vactor-Verse. Today on the show, we have returning guest all the way back. This goes, my returning guest today goes way, way back, even before this show was called the Vactor-Verse. He is a sometimes writer for Complex, GQ, comedically tall sweater Maven, tired and bored with himself. Mr. William Goodman, how are you, sir?
Do you know what tired and bored with myself is a reference to?
You know, you told me this one time, and I completely forgot.
It's a Bruce Springsteen lyric.
Yes.
from Dancing in the Dark.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, it's always funny when people read my Twitter bio because it's one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, that stuff is in there, isn't it? Yeah. How's it going, buddy? Nice to chat with you.
It's going very well, and you are one of my favorite people on the internet to talk to. We've met once in person on your way to Comic-Con many years ago.
Is it really just once? I thought it was twice. Does my memory betray me?
As far as I can remember, that was the only in-person appearance. The only time I got to see.
It feels like we hang out all the time.
Yeah,
buddy.
That was like the only time that I saw that William Goodman was a center for the Washington Wizards.
Was taking over DeAndre Ayton's minutes for the Phoenix Suns. I'm actually tall enough to be like a power forward. I think I'd be a little too short to. I'd be a good small ball center maybe, but not for any sort of big lineup for sure.
Yeah, man, I love talking to William Goodman. We actually used to have a podcast together where we talked about Mad Men way
That's
back
true.
in the day.
Yeah.
And you know, our lives have kind of intertwined all throughout. Mr. Goodman hosted a comic book podcast at one point, and Mr. Goodman hosted a podcast called "Is It Lit?" Was that the title? Is It Lit?
Yeah, very briefly. Yeah, that was more just supposed to be like a general pop culture thing. I don't know. All these are like podcast pre-podcast, right? Like it's this weird moment where with Between the Panels, I think had we continued even another year, I think there might have been some. I'm assuming things that probably aren't true. I would like to think that maybe if we continued a little bit longer, there might have been an opportunity for us. But yeah, we really kind of got out of the game right as things started blowing up, which is, I don't know. Get out before you're washed, right?
Man, I was actually very saddened to see you and Dane from KC, who is a viewer of this show, frequent commenter on this show. Dane, shout out to Dane. How you doing?
He's the best.
One of
Love that dude.
Very talented musician and graphic designer. But yeah, I was sad when you guys kind of hung up the microphones, but I'm always happy. I've had Dane on the show and I've had you on the show twice. So I'm always happy when you guys can come out. But you know what? Every time
we need to do one together. Sorry to interrupt. The three of us need to do one together.
Yes, actually, yes. Let's put a pin in that and talk off mic. But I would 100% be down for that. But every time I've had you on, I never got your origin story in comic books, which is interesting. I guess I kind of was there a little bit as you were progressing, so I kind of knew the story a little bit. But I want to go back to the very beginning. And how did you get involved in comic books? What was that origin story for you?
Yeah, I think we may have touched a little bit on this on Geekland, but maybe not as in depth as I think we're about to go here. But you know, in thinking about this, I think my entry point for comics, I don't think is dissimilar to a lot of millennials in the sense that the first awareness of superheroes I had were Sunday morning cartoons. So that's Spider-Man, that's X-Men, that's Superman, and that's Batman. And I would say primarily out of those four, it really was Batman and was Spider-Man. Those 90s animated shows, I think, really were the primary drivers. But the first time I ever distinctly remember, right, holding a comic book was my elementary school in South Carolina, in Greenville, South Carolina, had a fall festival. It was a hybrid fall festival and Halloween party kind of together at once. And I remember at the time, our school was being renovated, so a bunch of us were in portables. And at the end of the row of portables was kind of this was the where the bus pulled up. It was this side of a hill that had this kind of horseshoe shaped turnaround where buses would come in and depart. And underneath the awning, there was a vendor set up with a bunch of long boxes. And I just remember kind of coming up to the boxes because I think it had a bunch of superhero memorabilia in front of it and having an active awareness. It may have even had that Todd McFarlane image that's on your shirt, Justin. Just looking at it, I very distinctly remembered that McFarlane imagery as a kid. And I just thumbed through the long boxes until I found a copy of Spider-Man that looked cool. And naturally, of course, that was one of the overprinted holographic covers that they did in the 70s and 80s, right? So, or maybe even early 90s. I'm trying to think really kind of when that wave was. But that was very distinctly what I remember. It was an anniversary issue. The holographic cover, it was black and white. I think it was the first debut of the like silver and black armored Spider-Man suit. Yes. So I should have, if I had some more time, I should have gone through and looked up what exactly that issue was. Maybe you can do that, and for your sweet TikTok cuts that you do, you can show the cover there with a little bit of imagery as to what it is. Nevertheless, I remember my parents buying that issue for me, and that was really the first experience that I had. From there, I think there were a few other instances I think where maybe I got comic books kind of sporadically here and there, but I wasn't really, getting trades or anything like that. But during the first Spider-Man movie, I remember it was either Spider-Man, I think it was the first Spider-Man movie, or X-Men 2, one of the two, but same thing, went to a movie theater in town to see the movie, and there was a comic book store vendor set up inside the movie theater. So a lot of it was these opportunities to bring vendors in to provide an opportunity to show the source material to folks who are kind of coming in, right? And I feel like that is it's more of a rarity now. We don't have many of those opportunities, I think, as comic books have become. It's this weird thing that as comic book movies have gotten increasingly more popular, comic books themselves, I think, or the opportunities to, I think, talk about the source material have kind of decreased if you look at it on kind of a chart. It's an X, basically. And I was always so grateful as a kid to have those opportunities to go in and see these movies and have the opportunity to, if not buy a comic, at least thumb through those long boxes and have an awareness that comics were out there, right? And that these stories were based on something in the same way that there were plenty of movies or television shows that were based on books, right? So it's one of those things that I think I always knew that comic books existed in the world. There we go. That's the exact one.
Yeah.
But it was a holographic full. So what is this? Web of Spider-Man number 100. But it was, So actually, maybe that one was one of the ones that I got from seeing this particular one. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it had this black and silver holographic cover. Yeah. But I do remember that Web of Spider-Man getting it from the second long box excursion, right? And then, so that was, let's say that was X-Men 2, just to timestamp it, right? The first very distinctive memory of like actively pursuing, so I had an awareness of comic books, right? But I think a lot of it was tied specifically to Spider-Man specifically. One of the great things that I think Marvel did, and I really wish they would do this now, was when they relaunched the Ultimate line, they did something, I believe it was called Ultimate Marvel Magazine, I believe is what it was. And it essentially was an compilation series of them putting together with editorial, right? So it really was like a true magazine. There were interviews. I think there may have been an interview. I found some of them when I was cleaning out my house in South Carolina a couple years ago, and I think there was an interview with Robert Kirkman, who was writing Ultimate X-Men at the time. I think there was an interview with Bendis. There were writer or artist interviews. There were kind of news stories about upcoming feature film adaptations, but it served as a way to collect a bunch of issues of Ultimate Spider-Man, Ultimate X-Men, and the Ultimates, I believe, into one cohesive thing that was like a magazine, right? So in the same way that I could, when we as a family walked into our Books A Million location in Greenville, South Carolina, I immediately beelined it for the newsstand, for the magazine stand, to go and try and find the latest issue of this, because that was really the only awareness I had of a place where I could go to get comic books. My parents were very supportive of reading, but I don't think they were very supportive of reading comic books, because I think there was came from a good place that they felt like it was better served for me to read actual books than it was for me to read something that felt childish like a comic book did, right? Despite the fact that you and I both now know at this point, there's a lot of really dense, weighty, heady ideas that can exist in a comic book. And it's actually good if you spend time with engaging with that, especially at a young age, and can kind of pick apart some of that, those layers and you know, and not every single comic book is like that, right? But a lot of them I do think are right for large societal metaphors, right? X-Men is an easy one to point to and consistently point to. But I think even, Spider-Man, Batman have some of those same things. So, but Ultimate Marvel Magazine was this way for me to be able to have a consistent touch point where it's like, oh, I can follow this storyline because they're kind of restarting it. I think at this point, Ultimate Spider-Man had been around for a while, and they were basically just reprinting it and at a higher price point. Whereas, like, we can take this material and repackage it and sell it to a more mainstream audience that isn't a niche comic book store audience, basically. And it totally worked for me. From there, I think the Ultimate Marvel Magazine only lasted 11, 12, 13 issues. It really wasn't much past issue 13 of Ultimate Spider-Man, which or maybe that's issue 12, but it's the one where Peter has the conversation with Mary Jane about him being Spider-Man.
Ah, yes.
And Aunt May thinks that they're having sex for the first time, and because Peter like jumps up on the wall and all this different other stuff. Anyway, so then from there, I was able to start getting Ultimate Spider-Man delivered to me via mail order. And I can't remember if I was paying for that with lawn mowing money, because that's how I made money when I was a kid, or if that came from begging my parents to invest in a single comic book subscription. I think either Marvel stopped doing mail order or my parents stopped wanting to pay, or some combination of both. And then I don't think I really touched comic books until, I would say, probably around my junior year of high school, when I had access to a car. And that was right around, at the time, I was spending a lot of time on the internet reading IGN, particularly the comic book section, because that was a place where, I had always been interested in comics, but didn't really have much of an outlet to talk to people about it, or even really know where to go. And so I was spending a lot of time reading news articles about what was happening in Straczynski's Amazing Spider-Man run, or reading about what was happening in Civil War. And then as soon as I got access to a car and did some research about where comic book stores were in town, one actually opened not far from where my house was. And I think I was out somewhere else, and they had put business cards there advertising the store. And so I went to the store. And that was where, I believe at the time, Countdown was happening. 52 had just happened. 52 was the thing that really, I think, kind of drove me back in 52 and Civil War. Those were the two things where I was like, oh, these are cool, big events that are making an impact on this sector of the internet that I'm reading. Like, IGN's covering it. I spent a lot of time reading IGN for video game coverage. I'm starting to see these articles on the homepage when I check for video game coverage. I'm having a natural interest in that. You start to go down that rabbit hole, and then you naturally, again, having a car, having a little bit more disposable income, was like, let's see if I can find a spot. So it really was the recommendation that I got the first time I was at that store, which is now closed, unfortunately, but was the very first issue, the one-shot special of the Sinestro Corps War. Ooh. And that was really the thing that kicked off my love for, picking up comic books on a monthly basis and engaging in that conversation, seeking it out on message boards, trying to, find a community around that. Because even in reading that issue, I got to the page reveal where it's like the Anti-Monitor and Cyborg Superman, and I can't remember who the third villain is that they brought in to kind of wield one of the Sinestro Corps rings. It's not Sinestro, because he's been kind of assembling everybody at that point, but that final I'll leave a break in here for you to cut this. That final splash page was the moment where I was like, oh, as a medium, what you're able to do with comics, the potential is kind of limitless, right? If you have an artist, and Ethan Van Sciver has his issues now, right? But understandably, he has some talent. He's just unfortunately kind of a piece of shit now. That's putting it gently. But I just remember I was like, the only thing that is stopping you in a comic book is your imagination. If you have the skill and the talent to be able to do it, the ability to create these worlds and these incredibly vivid images, I just had such an appreciation for that, combined with, especially at that time, what Jeff Johns was doing with Green Lantern in terms of going back and building out this tremendous connective tissue of this world. I was just absolutely enthralled. And then from there, that springboarded into just being obsessed with every issue of Sinestro Corps War, tracking all of that down. That spread into Countdown, which mixed results there, right? But I just became, I really dove headfirst into this world. And it's so strange that it wasn't a Spider-Man book that pulled me into it, having almost exclusively history with Spider-Man. I did pick up Ultimate Spider-Man at that time, but Jeff Johns, that Green Lantern run, I still think it definitely has some ups and downs, but in the totality, it is one of like the defining works of comics of the last 2 decades, basically. And so that kind of dovetailed into me just putting a call out on Twitter that was basically, I want to start a comic book podcast. Dane responded. We did that show for a really long time and had a really great time doing it. And then, moving to DC and being a person in my mid-20s, wanted to spend more time being social. But even still, that love for comics never went away. And even in college, I used to really look forward to getting the message from my post office and my student union saying that my monthly DCB service order had shown up, right? And sitting down on a Friday afternoon and just catching up on a month's worth of comics. That stuff I really, really cherish and look forward to those moments. And I found comic book stores. I used to go every Wednesday on my lunch break when I was working my first career job out of college. Used to go on Wednesdays, the comic book store I went to, which is now closed, unfortunately, as well. Used to drive over there on my lunch break and grab those and sit at my desk while I was eating and thumb through whatever hot issue I was really looking forward to. So I really think it was just kind of these separate, disparate things, these touch points all along the way that have always really been there. But I think we're influenced, certainly by other exterior forces, right? I think I would not have been... I don't know if I would have necessarily gravitated towards comics if I hadn't necessarily, just come across those long boxes and had those opportunities to actually hold the tangible physical thing in my hand and see that and have a recognition that, oh, this cartoon that I was saying, I think just in talking to kids at school, I did realize that comic books existed. And, my dad read comics when he was a kid, certainly not to the extent that I did. But had some awareness of it, but it was always harder to wrap my hands around it because I couldn't just walk into a bookstore and find a comic book sitting on a shelf. Right? It was a trade. It was a collected edition. Even then, I didn't really understand that, and it took me a really long time to understand the difference between an omnibus or a trade or a graphic novel and the delineation between each one of those things. So having the opportunity to go physically thumb through those individual issues and pull one out and be enticed by a cover, or know that, oh, this issue, or this issue of Batman just looks really cool, or thumb through it and actually look at the art, and also being encouraged by the people who, the ones that weren't, some of them were bagged and boarded, but even then still having the opportunity to kind of sit and thumb through it. That's what I've always appreciated, is the ability to not sit down and read it in a store, but take a second, look through it, get a sense of kind of what it's about, look at the art, because it's so much more than just the cover. That tangible physical experience is really, I think, the thing that kind of really kickstarted that love for me.
And that's something that's very interesting to me, because I think about someone who's discovering comics today. And the way that I'm seeing it, at least I don't, because I'm not in that generation, I'm not coming across it, but the way that it seems like it's either in the movies or the shows, or it's social media like TikTok, Twitter, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts. It's something that they have on their device, on their phones mostly, and it's just one of many, avenues that they could go down. And the physical, like your experience, it seems to be more Barnes and Noble than anything else, where you go in, and I think that's a huge difference between American comic books and manga right now. I think people are going to Barnes and Noble and picking up mangas, or they're ordering them off Amazon. And the comic books, like you mentioned it in your journey, how many of your local comic book shops are no longer in business? And I think about my local store, Atomic Comics, which they just recently changed their name. But Atomic Comics was the big store. That was like the chain. They had like 5 locations. One day I showed up and it was just everything was boarded up. Like the door was closed off, locked. And they said, "Oh, we're bankrupt now. Where every location is closed." And I was like, "What?" There was no indication. And it took them many years until they came back. And that was only recently, like within the last year. And then they've now changed their name, like I said. So the management, they had some issues with the management, but it was Atomic Comics and Samurai Comics. And I'm thinking about also, even before that, it was gas stations, the spinner racks, like it was Walmart's.
It's so funny you bring up manga, and I completely forgot that whole section of my life. Like in middle school, I used to read, because it's one of those things you bring up manga and how it's packaged, right? Like it really is, your experience with it now is almost exclusively to read it in volumes, right?
Yes.
Unless you're reading Show and Jump, which I was able to actually find on the grocery stores at my local Bilo, which was even easier for me to go and have that. So I think this nebulous gap where I wasn't able to find issues of American comics on the bookstores, I filled that hole with Show and Jump instead, and was able to collect those, and that tied into my affinity for anime at the time. Spent a lot of time watching. That started with Pokemon, then went into Yu-Gi-Oh, then went into things like Shaman King, which I love. That's where I remember reading One Piece and Naruto for the first time, was in Show and Jump as those things kind of came out. And then so seeing it all these years later, it's like, I read that when I was like 14 years old, you know what I mean? And seeing it go on and be these huge monumental things now, it's kind of like, oh, that's really, really interesting. But yeah, so the I think what you're getting at here is something that I think is harder to find in general. It's just it's accessibility, right? And I think there was some excitement a couple of years ago when DC mentioned that they were going to start publishing comic books at grocery stores and stuff like that. I think if you, the key to, and this is totally me being Monday morning quarterbacking this, right? But it's like, I think any specialty store is really overwhelming to walk into. You're, 9 times out of 10, those communities are very insular. They're very gatekeepy. I'm very fortunate that here in DC, Phantom Comics, which is my local store, and I'll give them a shout out literally any time of the week, because they are so warm, so welcoming, so inviting. Their staff is very knowledgeable and isn't there to gatekeep. They're there to, also the way that the store is laid out and curated, it's very easy to wrap your head around. These are new comic books. These are graphic novels. These are collect editions broken down by publisher. Their indie section is just as big as their Marvel and their DC stuff, right? So there's a wide swath, but they do it really, really well. Some places don't do that, and I think it really just depends. Or if they do, they have staff that is, they're not keen. They're the comic book guy from The Simpsons, right? Like they're not very keen to sit down and actually walk you through that experience. And it's really frustrating, because I feel like if you give the right story to the right person that connect with it, that opens their world to this whole medium. I love to gift comics, because I think if you can sit down and find a graphic novel or a compendium of something. My sister-in-law, I gifted her the first compendium of Saga, and she was like, I had no idea that this existed. I didn't know comics could be this. Like, it's a little weird, but I'm really into it. I find it very interesting. Like, but I don't know if she would have ever set foot in a comic book store at UT Austin and like looked to even buy a comic book had I not gifted that to her, right? So I think the accessibility of it, I think, is really, really key. And it's slightly easier with some digital comics, but this could be a whole separate podcast, but the Comixology experience now is not a particularly friendly one.
Yeah.
And so I think if you're looking to try and get into comics, a Marvel Unlimited subscription makes sense. But then you look at that and it's, the Netflix problem, right? It's like, where do I start? I don't know. There's so many options. It's hard for me to kind of sit down. So that personal curation is always the way to go. But your point about, it's hard to be a brick and mortar store that focuses exclusively on comics. You have to be a multi-hyphenate. You have to be a game store and a collectible store. And, like Phantom, they sell board games. They sell collectibles. They do Magic the Gathering nights. They do nerd trivia. Like, they had a beer license so they could do like beer and wine on a Friday night with a trivia. You know what I mean? So they're expanding in lots of different other places because they can't just go all in on comics. They have to be sort of a pop culture store writ large, and it's definitely hard to do. It's really hard to do, and it's harder when these big movies are such a huge part of our pop culture, but don't do a good job of completing that feedback loop. Right. That's why I think I'd be curious for your opinion on this. I appreciate what James Gunn is doing in terms of drawing specific attention to, we are adapting Tom King's Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow run that he wrote with art by Bill Clifton. You can go and buy it, and doing that caused it to sell out on Amazon, caused it to sell out in stores. I think it's up to really these companies if to really push that, and if you do it in a hand in glove way, you can drive that, but you have to create a system in which to do that. And I just don't know if there's been much incentive to do that for whatever reason.
Yeah, the business of comics has always kind of fascinated me, because in order to sustain itself, you have to attract the new audience. You cannot just simply last on the people who've been reading it from the 80s, the 90s, now the 2000s. And how do you attract the younger audience? And that's been a question that I've been thinking about for at least, I want to say 15 years now. And it's with the advent of with the popularity of the MCU, it's something that it seems like, the characters are going to last, but the format, how do you keep comics alive? And the success of manga, like, you look at that model, I wonder if American comics are ever going to take that leap of going over in that direction. But what's really interesting me is the digital aspect of it. And I think when you were getting into comics, it was kind of around that time of the very early digital stuff. But you know what? I think my first memories really of digital was the New 52. And I think that was around the time that Comixology launched, because I have a picture of myself holding my iPad and the New 52 Superman issue. And I was so excited that the issue was coming out. And that was like 2011. And you look now, we're recording this in 2023. And you mentioned the Marvel, everything is now like a subscription service for the most part of the Marvel Unlimited, the DC, I don't even know what they call it, Infinite. And then you got the Comixology and Kindle Unlimited service. So those are the big ones. And there's like little indies that are popping up as well. But I wanted to actually ask your opinion on the evolution of physical to digital, because it's also a personal preference, I think. Like you mentioned, having the tactile feel of the books in your hand was a big reason why you were able to get into comics. this doesn't have to be specifically comics. For you, do you like the reading experience on a tablet, whether it be a book, a novel, a comic book? Do you like that, just the swipe instead of the page turn?
It's interesting. So I'm in a position where I kind of do a little bit of both. I realize that I am very rapidly running out of physical space to carry and hold some of these things. I have behind me on this bookshelf down underneath, I have some plastic bins with bags and boards. I'm not sure in the way that you frame this if you can necessarily see this or not. Nevertheless, they're down here. I have a long box over here in the corner that have bags and boards that need to be, taped down and fully assembled and whatnot. So I don't really understand why I guess I do kind of understand. One of the things I really appreciate about Marvel is the fact that they still continue to do a digital issue with every physical purchase that you have. So some of them the process has changed a couple of times. Some of them still have stickers with a code that you put in. Others of them, you actually have to take a physical photo of the front of the book and send it in to like a Q&A or like an automated service that then spits you out a code, just so you're not, walking into a store and
taking pictures.
Taking a picture of the QR of the 12-digit code. That takes a little bit longer, but I understand there needs to be a sense of like ownership of that, right? So I get it. It's a way to verify that you actually bought it. But so when I'm at home, I really do enjoy that experience of sitting down and thumbing through a comic book. But I do love to, in preparation for a flight, sit down and download a bunch of stuff on my Comixology account that I've been behind on. It was a little easier before the Amazon storefront, where I could just go to the dedicated Comixology store and
man, I missed that.
They're still there. It's just having to wade through that interface is so counterintuitive. I saw somebody, I think last week, the new issue of Amazing Spider-Man that came out, that's starting to dig into these revelations about like what Peter did. It's the big new story arc that I think Zeb Wells is doing. Yep. And he was trying to this person was trying to search for that specific issue on Comixology, and it's like Amazing Spider-Man number 26 or something like that, right? The issue with searching for that issue is that it is the third or fourth or fifth or sixth different Spider-Man number 26. So if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, that you're looking for the 2023 version versus the 1983 version, right? It's really counterintuitive to be able to go and find that if you're somebody that's like very interested in comics. And as somebody who even is interested in comics, searching through the storefront is just very back-ass words. It really does not make a ton of sense. And I really used to love looking for those weekly 99-cent sales and being like, actually I haven't read all of Ed Brubaker's Daredevil run. Would love to go through and do this, because to me, if I don't know if I am going to love that story, I'm out $30 as opposed to $100 because I bought an omnibus, right? So it became easier for me to take a flyer on something where I could sit down and read an issue of, Hellboy in Hell, for example, digitally, and be like, oh, actually, I like that so much that I want to go buy the trade because I loved that story.
Yeah.
And now just that process is so much more difficult now. It's also just not a top of mind thing. Like, it used to be so ingrained to just go to Comixology every Tuesday when stuff came out, and now I don't think it's like, oh, I have to go to Amazon to do that. And the only time I go to Amazon is like, oh, I need soap, or I need toilet paper. You know what I mean? Like, I don't really spend a ton of time like browsing the digital aisles of Amazon for stuff unless I'm looking for like 4K Blu-rays or something like that. So it's a change in mentality, and it's really frustrating because I really enjoyed that experience. So a very long-winded answer of which this has been very long-winded in general, but it's a kind of a case-by-case basis. Like, I like having the physical things, but I also appreciate the flexibility of digital, especially realizing that I'm starting to run out of space in this lovely rental house in Washington, D.C., but at the same time, it does not have room for 20 different long boxes in it.
Right. Because I've heard stories of guys on podcasts Yeah, I have an entire room in my house for my long boxes, and I'm like, I don't ever. I mean, more power to you, but I don't have that
Sure.
type of room to do that.
Yeah. So
And
you're almost digital exclusive at this point.
yeah, I'm about 99% digital at this point, and I was specifically buying Saga
Mm-hmm.
physically and digitally. And I had
Mm-hmm.
this thing in my mind where I was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to support Brian K. Vaughan because he's my favorite writer. And I'm just going
Mm-hmm.
to buy it in every format. And then I want to say, like, either last month or the month before that, I was like, why am I doing this? I am supporting him by buying the digital. Why am I doing, well, actually, no, I'm sorry, twofold. I also wanted to support my local comic book shop. That was the other reason.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually I just got to the point where I was like, I could just do this digitally. It's more convenient for me. And especially now that I have a son, my time is also limited up going to the shop, going to the store.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I'm, pretty much exclusively digital at this point. I will say with Amazon, one thing that I really do like is if you sign up for to follow certain artists, like let's say
Mm-hmm.
Brian K. Vaughan, you can click on their name and it'll say follow. They will
Mm-hmm.
email you every time there's a new book. You can also subscribe to Saga, and every time there's a new issue, they'll send it to you. So
Yeah.
I like that.
That feature is really great. It's the equivalent of a digital pull list at that
Yes,
point,
right.
right? And a buddy of mine, he actually does it where he and I kind of like password share a Comixology account, and he will buy Saga digitally to keep up with and read. So we have copies of it, and so he has that. We have a subscription for that, but it still doesn't. The way in which the Comixology store used to present and frame those 99-cent sales was just so. I mean, it was better when everything was actually in the app before they, divorced the storefront from.
The app itself.
It was better before there was eventually that divorce where they took the store out of it, and because of the Apple of it all, right, and then just had the store online and had the Comixology app essentially as an e-reader. And when Amazon bought Comixology and went through that transition, I saw a lot of pushback about the actual Comixology app, and I don't know if I necessarily agreed with some of those criticisms, but the criticisms about the store, like the way that the Comixology app actually bundles everything now, as I'm sure but for listeners or watchers who don't, is every single thing is categorized by title, by author, by writer. So like all of Jason Aaron's X-Men run, for example, is collated in one single place, and that includes trades, that includes single issues, whereas before they used to be these separate, disparate things. So it was like, wait a second, I have 10 trades of Avengers here, but I don't know when that ends. So then I need to go through and hunt down the individual issues of Avengers in my Comixology account and figure out where that is. Now it's all in one place, which I like that. I wish the storefront was intuitive as the UI on the app was, because it's two radically different experiences.
Yeah, man, I do miss the early Comixology days. And then
we didn't know what we had, did we?
Yeah, that was. There's no way that we could predict what was going to happen with Amazon. And even when Amazon bought them, I was like, oh yeah, this will be a good thing because Amazon has the resources, they have, the marketing and the just the muscle of Amazon. But now looking back on it, it was like, man, I wish they had just kind of stayed independent. But yeah, I think that's the subscription model is really what's keeping me on digital nowadays, of twofold actually. The subscription of getting it just automatically delivered to me. That's just
spoon fed to you.
That's just so easy and convenient. But then the Netflix model of, hey, I'll just pay a yearly price and I'll just get everything. And that has been good for me. The only downside I would say with that model is the having to wait for months for certain issues. Like I want to get the issue when it comes out, so I've split it where I'm actually buying issues of like the books that I really want to keep up with, but then I'm also subscribed to the Marvel service, and I'm going to get those issues eventually, but I don't want to wait 3 months or 6 months or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think the lag time on DC Infinite is much better now. I think it's only a month
Yes.
behind at this point, or a couple of weeks, but the lag in Marvel is like pretty significant. I think you mentioned it's several months to even
Yeah.
6 months.
I wanna say it
That's
was
just sort of,
yeah.
candidly, it's a little untenable to me. I understand it as an archival resource. That makes a ton of sense, right? Like if I want to go through and read all of Chris Claremont's X-Men, like that's much easier to go through and do that than it would be to hunt those things down in Comixology, right? But if you're trying to encourage comic book reading and active comic book reading, you've got to view it in the same way that like Netflix views this stuff, right? Where it's like they're putting new stuff on the surface every single week. Like I just don't understand why you wouldn't charge a higher premium and have that level of access. But I'm sure those conversations have been had internally at Marvel, and they just don't see the value in it. But it is the DC model where I think it's only a month behind. I think is much better, and I think that's how I would kind of prefer it to be of those two.
Yeah,
sure.
And they're doing a new thing now. I don't know if you've seen this. There's an ultra tier of the DC Infinite, and the window is the smallest. And I just read this morning a Superboy book that hasn't come out yet, and it was a ultra, like you got access to it because you're an ultra subscriber. So there's that. I think Marvel needs to kind of take a look at what DC is doing in that aspect. But also, you touched on the archival nature of it. This is also a problem with digital. The scans for like older comics sometimes are not the greatest, because I was actually just going back and rereading Ultimate Spider-Man because I was going to be appearing on a podcast. So I was like, oh, I haven't read Ultimate Spider-Man since it came out, right? Like the beginning of it. So I went back and I was like, man, some of these scans are just not super high quality. So that's the other issue with digital, I think, is sometimes I'll run into stuff and I'm like, even the Dan Slott Silver Surfer run, which wasn't that long ago.
No, that was Marvel Now. So that was 2012, 13, somewhere in there. That's like within the last decade for sure.
Yeah. And
that's really disappointing.
Yeah. Those issues, because it fell through the cracks. Like I wanted to read that, but I just never got around to it. So
same. I have it on Comixology and have the exact same thing. It's sitting there waiting for me to read on a plane sometime, and I've been like slowly working my way through Jason Aaron's Avengers, like on flights randomly off and on for the last 9 months. It's like, oh, yep, I'll sit down and can't wait to read a whole trade of Werewolf She-Hulk on the plane. And I enjoy that experience, but that's really, really frustrating.
Yeah.
And makes me understand why people then turn to things like piracy as archival, right? It's the same argument that's been being made in movies right now as things disappear from streaming services and so on and so forth, or really shoddy prints end up online. It's like, why would I sit down and watch this? Like every couple of months, right? Netflix will have something where they put something on the streaming service and the aspect ratio is completely flipped, or the letterbox presentation is not very good. And it's like, why would I do this if I could just go torrent the thing that's actually like a really good quality rip? I mean, I understand why you don't do it, right? But there are some cases in which the people who are providing that care more about it than the people who actually made it to begin with. And it's really disappointing that something like Ultimate Spider-Man, which is kind of the thing that saved Marvel in the early aughts, like can't even be given the treatment it rightfully deserves.
Right.
And if that's happening for Ultimate Spider-Man, like who knows what's happening for, to your point, Silver Surfer or any of these other things.
Yeah. So hopefully they can remedy that. But you make a very good point about the things disappearing. And even just this last week, I kind of ran into that with the 1993 Super Mario Brothers movie with John Leguizamo. And it was like, oh, it's not available anywhere. So I just want to show my son, like, hey, look, this is Mario. Like he's not even old enough to care about it, but I'm like, yeah, look at this old Mario movie. And it's like, well, what do you do at that point when it's just not available? You can go track down a DVD or a a VHS. Because actually, that's another good point, is some of these things are not even making the transition to the current format. Like we've lost things from VHS to DVD, from DVD to Blu-ray. And so at that point, it's like, yeah, you don't have any other alternative besides piracy at that point, because yeah, it's available. If you go into those other into the piracy lands, you'll find those Super Mario Brothers movie, or you'll find whatever you're looking for. So yeah, hopefully comics can kind of solve that issue, because it comes to a point where accessibility is very important. Like you said, for people getting into it, if you don't have the access, because like we live in this time where we have access to so much media and so much content, and then for you to lose like specific pieces of pop culture, it's kind of disappointing. But hopefully we can get around to that. But it's always interesting just to have these conversations of what is your current way of consuming media specifically. I always like that.
Have you found kind of, what has the split been in the conversations that you've been having? Is it are people still ride or die print? Are there people that are only exclusively digital? Like, if you had to ballpark it, is there more of a majority on one side of the equation or the other?
Right now, I still get a 50-50 vibe. And I think it's because I talk to people who are more hardcore than the regular, the average person. I think the hardcore person is going to go to their comic shop, have a pull list, set those things up, or they're going to be looking at, DCBS, or they're going to be looking at the online places, and they're going to search out those physical books. But for somebody who's new, or somebody who's a casual fan necessarily, it's like, oh, well, if they don't have it on Amazon, I'm not going to track it down, or they don't have it at Barnes & Noble, I guess I'm not reading that. I guess I'm not going into that. So I think you and I are kind of in the same ballpark of, I want comics to continue. I want the next generation to have what I had. I want them to be able to read the Sinestro Corps War. I want them to be able to read All-Star Superman, or whatever it is. So I really like what James Gunn is doing. And you notice it even in the marketing of like that Blue Beetle trailer at the end. Hey, these are some Blue Beetle comics. And it's like, why doesn't Marvel do that? Why don't they just kind of point you in that direction? And you had that great experience of the movie theater having comics there. Like, I want to see that every week.
I think so I wonder if some of that changes with the changes that Disney's been making at the Marvel Entertainment side of things, right? We saw Ike Perlmutter be sort of ejected from the Disney board, and his sort of ownership stake in the Marvel Entertainment side, which is that's Marvel Publishing, right? And that's sort of being taken and being reorganized and folded into like the Disney Publishing side of things. So, if you read trade reporting, there was some very, very clear tension between Ike and Marvel Entertainment and Kevin Feige and Marvel Studios, right? And that's what led to the reorg that happened right around the time of Captain America: Civil War. Was basically, it's been reported that Kevin Feige was kind of like, you need to put me underneath you or I'm going to walk. Basically, because I'm tired of dealing with Ike and dealing with his, Ike had some very antiquated views. He was a huge penny pincher. He used to famously, he would go through the trash cans at Marvel Publishing and take out paper clips that had been thrown away to repurpose and reuse. Yes. So he's not really been seen in the public. One of the last times he was photographed with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. If you want kind of perspective into his ideologies, I think he was very resilient to things like Black Panther and Captain Marvel and really pushing those movies. And it took a lot of doing on Kevin Feige's part to push those things through. Dang. So there's been some, I don't think he has necessarily been very good for Marvel. I am very curious to see how much of that changes moving forward. I would hope that what DC is doing, even in the same way that we get these kind of show, if you go to the movies now, you get these messages from Chris Pine and the cast of D&D there. It's like, thank you for, you're the real hero for coming to the movies. And it's like, that's silly, but like, I appreciate the goodwill gesture, right? I'm hopeful that DC will kind of start to take a step forward and not only do that, not only show the comic books at the end of a trailer, but we'll have something like that where it's the director or the stars of the film and say, hey, these are the comic books that influenced this movie. You should go and check them out at your local comic book store. There used to be like 1-800-comic-book used to be the hotline, I think, where you could call and figure out where your comic book store was. And I think that eventually became a website. I'm not sure if it still exists or not. Yeah. But have some sort of directory that's kind of like, a nonprofit thing that allows you to it doesn't even need to be that. There can just be like Google your local comic book store. Right. So, but to try and foster some of that, I think including that stuff at the end of the Blue Beetle trailer is a tremendous step in the right direction, and I hope that continues, and I hope it is something that Marvel continues to leverage on, even though, I was having a conversation with somebody about this the other day. Secret Invasion is not really Secret Invasion, right? Like they kind of pulled a vague premise of that from the comic book of the same name, but the core of it is still kind of there. Shape-shifting Skrull is kind of invading Earth, but like Jessica Drew is not a part of that story. Is not going to be a part of this, this thing. It's much more of a Nick Fury focused event than it is this huge crossover with, that was like years and years of the making, and Elektra as a Skrull that was seated in Mighty Avengers 2 years before the event started, right? So which is something else I remember. Secret Invasion was really, I think, the first big like Marvel crossover that I ended up picking up. So I'm hopeful that some of that stuff will change. But I do think the other thing, part of it too, is just getting that element of curation and being able to take a physical collected edition and pass that off to someone and just be like, here's this one thing. And then if they come back to you and say, hey, I really like this, can you make some other recommendations? Being able to then take our knowledge and kind of being able to disseminate that around. That's how I think you grow and foster and change and I shouldn't say change, but that's how you grow interest, right? As you introduce somebody to something, they realize kind of the extent of what you can do and the medium, and then hopefully they seek out more things, whether they come back to you for recommendations or they go to Barnes & Noble and stumble into the manga section because they like Death Note or whatever it may be, right? Hopefully that kind of, you can foster that kind of level of excitement just by making a good recommendation. In the same way that somebody would recommend you a good book, you might go search for other books written by that particular author. Right.
Man, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I think I want to have William Goodman back on in some type of regular capacity, and because as you saw in this episode, viewer, he has so much insight into the current television and movie side of comics, and he's writing some fantastic stuff. I try to retweet it anytime I can, but I'll leave a link down in the show notes today for Mr. Goodman's writing. Anytime there's a review, anytime there's like a just an opinion piece, Mr. Goodman is always fascinating. Not only is he entertaining, but he's insightful, he's intelligent, and so you have that combination of he's going to entertain you and he's going to educate you. That is a winning combination. So, Mr. Goodman, I hope that we can have you back on the Vactor-Verse for some future, like some type of like Hollywood report or something like that, like what's going on in Marvel right now, what's going on in DC. We'll talk off microphone, but I want to have you back in some capacity, my friend. Until then,
anytime, my man. Yeah. We had to move this one around because I got some last minute press screenings, but anytime, always happy to chop it up.
Yeah, Mr. Goodman is a fantastic person, and I think everyone should check out all of his writings because, like I said, he's a very insightful and intelligent man. So you're going to love Mr. Goodman just the same way Mr. Goodman loves comics, and you should too.